what is happening right now is that we're seeing advances designed to effectively secure the axes of advance for the mobilized force that is being marshaled in the south. Now, what's the mobilized force? Well, we're looking at 250,000 right now of the Russian combat troops. Some of them are south and a little east of Zaporozhye when you look at the map. Others are just behind Bakhmut, which they are waiting for the Wagner military group to clean up. And then the other group is over near Liman, which is just east of Kharkov. And there, remember, we talked about three major concentrations, one in Western Russia, one down in the south, and one up in Belarus. The one in Belarus is sitting quietly, but is prepared, whatever comes. But these forces are going to move on at least two, maybe three axes, but they're not going to move until it's completely clear. And if we look at the strikes that are going in right now, air, missile, rocket, artillery, they're stripping out all of the air defense radars and all the air defense artillery that's out there. So they want to be sure that they have a clear open field for their close air support, for their drones, for their rockets, for their missiles. Sometime in the next few days, we're going to see this gargantuan move north and west out of those three areas.
Let me just interrupt you. Gargantuan meaning with respect to the number of boots on the ground.
Yes.
Do troops literally walk miles on the ground? Or
no, almost everyone. No. Almost everyone will ride. Most of your infantry will be armored infantry, following behind armor, artillery strikes, and so forth. So no, people are not walking at all. Now, you've seen elite light infantry from the Russian side confront Ukrainians in places like Bakhmut, Ugledar, elsewhere. You're now going to see the thing change with the armored force moving forward because the terrain favors fields of fire and the kind of rolling open terrain that is good for armor. And this is perfect for the Russian way of warfare. That's what we're going to see. But it's going to be an incremental rollout. Remember, the majority of the forces the Russians are now moving forward are not bloodied. These are not people with lots of combat experience. On the contrary, many of them are fresh recruits or reservists that haven't seen much, but they are under the command of experienced combat officers. That's what counts. And thus far, they have been moved up to the line, exposed, brought back repeatedly, shifted back and forth. They've practiced their maneuvers. They're ready to go. So once these last remaining strong points on the edge of the Donbass are gone, then we'll see them move. And their goal is everything east of the Dnieper River. In other words, everything from the Russian border to Kyiv.
Chris Cuomo is over in Ukraine, and I did what I thought was an excellent report, interviewing young Ukrainian either recruits or conscripts. Colonel, when I say young, I'm talking about 16 or 17 years old. In his report, he showed them doing serious military drills, and then he interviews one of them who speaks English, who tells him at his age, he has been to the front lines, he has seen blood and death, he's not afraid of it himself. Is there some age, I should know this, either internationally or legally in Ukraine, below which human beings cannot be put into battle?
Well, there should be, but there won't be, because it depends on how desperate the state is to survive. Right now, the Ukrainian state is desperate to survive. So they're going to reach down very, very low. But there are a couple of things here, Judge, that should be mentioned. Just because some of these kids may be 15, 16, 17, doesn't mean they can't be effective. In fact, there's a lot of history that suggests that they can be very lethal. We talk about our landings in Normandy. And when we faced the 2nd Waffen-SS Panzer Corps, we were complaining about all these veteran soldiers. In reality, more than 85% of the soldiers were under the age of 19. And they fought ferociously, and they inflicted 3 casualties for every one that they took.
These are German soldiers or American?
Germans against us and the British.
Us. Wow.
This was June of 1944 and July of 1944. Now, my point is this. Young soldiers that have never seen action are frequently much braver than those of us that have seen action.
Well,
simply because we've survived some encounters. We know how lethal it is. They don't. So I believe the young man. But the sad truth of the matter is that no matter how brave you are, and no matter how much willpower you may possess, against overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower, it's pointless.
All right.
Overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower is what the Russians are going to bring to bear.
This is worse than propaganda. This is utter bullshit.
Well, in defense of Mr. Van Dyke, he said this is the one conscript that he'd spoken to. So let's be a little understanding. He spoke to one. That may well have been the attitude of one conscript. But
right.
Frankly, towards the end of the Second World War, all of the European nations that were engaged in the fighting were running out of manpower. There wasn't much enthusiasm in the last 6 months of the war to go out and be killed after just a minimum training and equipping. So I have trouble with that. The other thing is that I know that the SBU, the NKVD equivalent on the Ukrainian side, is rounding up and sending deserters back to the front, and they've got lots and lots of deserters. Many of them are very young, and they have executed some of them as an object lesson. So I think things are much worse on the Ukrainian side than obviously Van Dyke is willing to admit, and many others will.
Let's switch gears to the balloon. The balloon that captured in the American imagination and people staring in the sky for hours 2 weekends ago.
Mm-hmm.
A person you and I know of, Gordon Chang, from time to time on Fox News, holds himself out as an expert on China, argues that the balloon flew over Malmstein Air Force Base, where approximately a third of America's land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are stored. Then it flew near both the Warren and Minot Air Force bases, which house the remainder of America's Minuteman wings. Then it passed close to Whiteman Air Force Base, home to the nuclear-capable B-2 bomber, and then Offutt Air Force Base, headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. Quote, this path suggests China is gathering intelligence for either a first or second strike on America's nukes, close quote. Should we believe this stuff?
The short answer is no. First of all, you don't steer balloons. I'm sorry, but it's very difficult. Once you launch the thing into the atmosphere, the predominant winds have a bad habit of moving it wherever it wants to go. Secondly, I talked to someone at the U.S. Weather Service, and they told me that the path taken by it was roughly equivalent to where the jet stream goes across North America. That it went over those areas is probably not necessarily deliberate. It simply worked out that way. And again, assuming this thing was collecting intelligence, I have great doubts about that. I'm prepared to believe in many things, but I don't think it can collect much. They have 300 satellites, 100 of which are military. There's no shortage of opportunity for the Chinese to find out anything they want without relying on something like a balloon. And then we haven't even talked about something mentioned in USA Today, which is about the thousands of Chinese in our university and corporate laboratories, the thousands of Chinese who've come here illegally to the southern border. We've had 5 million illegals enter the country since President Biden took over. All of that is infinitely more important. So no, I don't think so. And I think he's discarding the reality that the Chinese were the first to adopt a no first use. And they mean it. And if you look at the structure of their nuclear arsenal, they are not postured to deliver a decisive first strike. They're postured to deliver a certain second strike.
General Stoltenberg said that he thought the balloon was a joint Russia-Chinese operation. Do you know, or have you heard any evidence of that other than Stoltenberg's opinion?
No. I think anything that you hear at this point about these balloons you should be skeptical. And that is probably the funniest one I've heard yet. You know, let's spread the blame for the evil balloon around and insist the Russians had a hand in it. Again, the Russians have more satellites than the Chinese. It's just crazy nonsense.
Okay. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, when it happened, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State, I'm not certain of her title, Victoria Nuland, we know who she is, we know what she's done in the past, all said the Russians did it. President Putin truthfully said, what are you, crazy? Why would we do that to our own industry? The Americans did it. Cy Hirsch, he of Watergate, CIA spying, domestic spying, My Lai massacre, Pulitzer Prize fame, probably the best, all right, Bob Woodward, don't get mad at me, the best investigative reporter in the United States, comes up with a lengthy piece with 3 sources, that's his reputation for every allegation in there, demonstrating President Biden ordered explosives put down there in June and the explosives detonated in September. He had the explosives put there by Navy SEALs, military, planned by CIA intelligence, triggered by CIA intelligence, so he can claim it was intelligence and not military. Have you ever heard of an American president using intelligence and military resources to attack an ally, Germany?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not heard of that. It's the first time that we've done that, I guess, and that's very unfortunate because Germany didn't deserve it. I'm not sure it should have happened one way or the other. It was effectively an act of war, in my judgment, under international law.
Yes, Colonel, it might have been a war crime because they attacked a non-military target for a non-military purpose.
Well, that's true. You know, we haven't been very good historically in tracking those things and holding anybody accountable for them, but I'm sure you're probably right. The bottom line is Cy Hirsch is many things, but he's an honest man. He makes honest mistakes like we all do from time to time. But I think his track record is excellent. And this particular incident, everything he describes is plausible. Because if you'd have moved this through Special Operations Command, it would have been very difficult to keep this concealed from Congress. Not that Congress has stood up lately and made any difference, but nevertheless, that's true. So he went, apparently CIA, Department of the Navy. That certainly makes sense to me. I just regret the whole thing. I think it was totally unnecessary. It makes it harder to end the conflict. And again, whenever you make the decision, as we have, to precipitate this war, and people need to understand that long before this thing began with Russians intervening in Ukraine, 14,000 people were killed since 2014 in those 2 Russian autonomous republics. And that was one of the points that Putin wanted to put an end to, the violence against Russian citizens living in Ukraine. Long before that happened, we refused to honor anything that the Russians wanted, said, or thought, or did. We treated it all with complete contempt. This particular action makes it much, much harder to end the war. When you go into something like this, you should always think about, how do I end it? How do we put an end to this?